When she was found, she looked like she just emerged from a nightmare that had lasted for weeks. Her body was emaciated, her skin was covered in bruises and abrasions, her hair was tousled, and her gaze was empty and distant. She stood on the side of the road like someone who hadn't yet fully realized it was over. When people spotted her, no one doubted they were looking at a victim. Within hours, she begins to recount what happened. She says she was kidnapped, held captive, her every move monitored, deprived of food and freedom. The story is so detailed and emotional that it leaves no room for doubt. People believe it immediately. The media picks up every detail, the police begin searching for the kidnappers. The entire country follows the events. But time passes, and gradually it becomes clear that there are details in the story that cannot be explained. Details that not only raise questions, they undermine everything that has been said. Until that day, her life had been like thousands of others, calm, predictable, and almost unnoticed. Sherri Papini lived in Redding, a small town in Northern California, where people were accustomed to quiet, familiar faces, and a sense of safety. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect to hear about high-profile crimes or strange disappearances. Here, life flowed smoothly, neighbors knew each other, the streets were quiet, and days rarely brought anything unexpected. Her life centered around her family. 2 small children, daily chores, routine tasks repeated day after day. Mornings began with the same routines as the day before: breakfast, getting ready, taking care of the house. There's nothing unusual about such details, but they create a sense of stability that from the outside seems secure and safe. People who knew her saw her as an ordinary person, part of a familiar environment, with no obvious signs that anything else might lurk behind this outward normality. November 2nd, 2016 began like any other day. No signs of alarm, no hints that anything could go wrong. A normal morning, normal activities, normal passage of time. At some point, she decided to go for a run. It didn't feel spontaneous, it was a part of her usual behavior. Something she'd done before. She knew the road, knew the area, knew how long it usually took. Such moments feel completely safe. They raise no questions, attract no attention, leave no sense of risk. A person leaves the house with the understanding that she'll be back soon, that nothing will change, that everything will remain as it was. When she didn't return home, at first it didn't seem alarming, because such delays happen. People can get distracted, change their route, or simply miss the call. But the more time passes, the more this sense of normalcy began to fade. Her husband first waited, then started calling, then checked his phone over and over again, hoping to see a missed call or message. But there was no answer. And at some point, it no longer seemed like an accident. He decided to use her phone's geolocation, and it was this move that marked the first real moment when the situation began to take shape. The signal led him to a spot near the road, in a stretch that didn't seem dangerous in itself. When he arrived, everything seemed too calm. No bustle, no people, nothing to indicate that anything serious had happened here. But then he saw her phone. It was lying on the ground. Beside it were her headphones. And it's at that moment that everything changes, because the scene he sees doesn't match what he expected. In such situations, chaos always remains, evidence of a struggle, damage, signs of sudden movement. But here, everything looked different. The phone wasn't broken, the headphones weren't scattered. They lay neatly as if they'd been placed there on purpose. This detail seems insignificant only at first glance, but it's precisely this that creates the sense that this isn't an accident, that there's an element of control here, that this isn't just a disappearance but a scene left behind after something more complex. From that moment on, everything starts moving faster. The police are involved almost immediately. They inspect the scene, documenting every detail, trying to figure out exactly what happened. A search begins, quickly expanding beyond a single street or neighborhood. Possible roads she might have taken are checked, neighbors are questioned, surveillance cameras are checked, but the more effort they put into it, the less clear it becomes. Because in all this time, not a single lead has emerged, not a single witness who saw what happened, no footage that could explain the situation, not a single sign of where she might have disappeared to. And that's what begins to frighten them the most, because the lack of information creates the feeling that the person has simply vanished without a trace. The search continues, and the situation grows more tense with each passing day. In such cases, time is against the person, and everyone, the police, the family, and those following the news knows it. The more time passes, the less likely a favorable outcome appears, and this feeling gradually begins to weigh on everyone involved. The story quickly spreads beyond the city. It begins to be discussed at the state level, then nationally. The media publishes her photos, recounts the details, and interviews her husband. His words ring true. He says he can't understand who could have done this or why, and asks for her to be brought home. These appeals intensify the emotional response, and the story begins to be perceived not simply as a disappearance, but as a personal tragedy followed by thousands of people. Days pass, then weeks, and all this time there is no answer. But then, 22 days later, something happens that completely changes the course of events. Early in the morning, people spot her on the side of the road and immediately recognize her. Her condition is shocking. She looks exhausted, her body is weakened, her skin is covered in bruises and signs of trauma, giving the impression that she's been through something traumatic. She doesn't look like someone who simply left and returned. She looks like someone who's been through something serious. She says she was kidnapped. She talks about the two women who held her captive. She describes the restrictions, the control, the fear she experienced. Her story is detailed, and that's what makes it compelling. People begin to accept her words as truth because her appearance, her condition, her emotions, everything matches what she says. The story changes instantly. It's no longer just a disappearance, it's a story of survival. The media picks up on every detail. People discuss it, worry, express support. The story becomes even more expansive, even more emotional. But it's at this point that the first cracks begin to appear. The turning point doesn't come immediately, but gradually. As often happens in such cases, at first, investigators continue to follow her lead, checking information about the suspected kidnappers, trying to find any confirmation of her claims. They analyze roads, check possible holding areas, and interview people who might have seen something. But the more effort they put into it, the less clear it becomes, because none of the checks yield any results that would confirm her story. It's at this point that the investigation begins to shift in a different direction. Investigators begin to more closely analyze not only the external facts, but also her behavior, her words, her reactions. They pay attention to how she describes what happened, what details she emphasizes, and what she omits. In situations like this, even the smallest details can be significant because they often conceal inconsistencies. One such detail is DNA. The test results show that there are traces on her body that don't match her version of events. These traces belong to a man, and this marks the point at which the investigation can no longer proceed on its current path, because this fact cannot be explained within the framework of her story. If she was held by two women, as she claimed, then the appearance of a man undermines her entire story. From that moment on, investigators begin working differently. They check her past, her contacts, and people with whom she might have been connected. They've been looking not for the kidnappers, but for an explanation for what actually happened. And gradually, attention focuses on one person, a man she knew previously. When they find him, the picture begins to come together. It turns out she was in his custody this entire time, not under his control, not in conditions that could be called captivity, but in a situation that didn't match her story. She could have moved freely, she could have left, but she didn't. This fact becomes crucial because after it, the whole story begins to unravel. Investigators continue to gather evidence, piece together facts, and each new detail only reinforces this feeling. Injuries previously perceived as the result of violence begin to be seen differently. Some of them turn out to have been inflicted under circumstances that don't match her version of events. Her appearance, her condition, all of it no longer seems so clear-cut. Even her behavior after her return begins to be perceived differently. Details that previously seemed natural begin to seem strange. Reactions, words, descriptions, all are analyzed anew, now with the understanding that the original version may be false, and at some point it becomes clear this is not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not a partial distortion. This is a fully constructed story. She was not kidnapped, she was not held captive, she was not deprived of her freedom. All these days she was in a place to which she came of her own accord. And it is this moment that becomes the climax of the entire story, because it completely overturns everything that happened before, everything people believed, everything that seemed obvious, everything that evoked sympathy. It turns out to be part of one great lie. And the clearer this picture becomes, the stronger the feeling that reality has turned out to be much stranger and more disturbing than the original version. When investigators track down the man she was involved with, the picture begins to really come together. This man turns out to be her ex-boyfriend, James Reyes, with whom she had a relationship long before this whole thing. They weren't casual acquaintances. He was someone from her past, someone she had deliberately reached out to. The investigation reveals that he was the one who took her on the day she disappeared. And it was with him that she had spent all those weeks. She was in his home in Costa Mesa, California, hundreds of miles from where they were searching for her. It wasn't a shelter designed to hold a person, it was an ordinary house. And that's what makes the situation even stranger. She wasn't locked in the basement, under constant surveillance, unable to leave. She could move around the house, could interact with the environment, but she didn't. According to Reyes himself, she asked him to help her disappear. He claimed he agreed without fully understanding the consequences and that he did not hold her by force during those weeks. Moreover, the investigation revealed that some of the injuries that later became part of her story were inflicted during this period. For example, he admits to helping her create the appearance of beatings, including hitting her at her request, to make it look like she had been kidnapped. It was also reported that she inflicted some of the injuries on herself, adding to the overall effect. When the moment of return arrives, everything unfolds according to a pre-planned scenario. She leaves the house and is soon found on the side of the road, in a condition that should have confirmed her story. She looked emaciated, her body bore signs of trauma, and all of this fit perfectly with the version of events she later told. But it is precisely these details that lead to her exposure, because reality turns out to be much simpler and at the same time much stranger. She wasn't a victim, she was a participant. And this is precisely what transforms the entire story from a tragedy into one of the most talked about cases of deception. One that not only captured the nation's attention, but also left behind consequences that are felt far longer than the disappearance itself. In 2022, Sherri Papini formally pleaded guilty. She is accused of lying to federal agents and fraud, as significant resources, including funds allocated for the investigation, were expected during the search for her. This concerns not only the work of the police, but also the federal funds allocated for her search and support. The court views this case as a serious violation, as such actions undermine credibility in genuine disappearance cases. Ultimately, she is sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution in excess of $300,000 to cover part of the costs associated with the investigation and search. She is sent to federal prison, and this moment marks the final point in her story as a victim. She is now officially recognized as someone who deliberately misled not only her loved ones, but the entire country. Taking into account her sentence and possible reduction for good behavior, her release was accepted around late 2023 or early 2024. And that's exactly what's happening. She's being released early, which is standard practice for such cases. But even after her release, her story isn't over because the consequences remain. The story dealt a particular blow to her family, as they were the ones who believed her story the most and were the most drawn into this deception. Her husband, who had given interviews, publicly pleaded for her return home and appeared to be experiencing genuine tragedy, ultimately found himself in a situation where everything he believed was revealed to be a lie. After the truth came to life, the relationship couldn't withstand the pressure. In 2022, he filed for divorce, and they later officially separated. In his statements, he emphasizes that he had acted sincerely and was unaware of what was happening, and that his primary goal was to protect his children and shield them from the consequences of the story. The family's reaction was generally restrained, but clearly painful. Instead of the relief that usually comes with the return of a missing person, they were faced with a new reality, in which they had to rethink everything that had happened and live with the consequences of what had become known to the entire country. At first glance, it may seem that the story ended the moment the verdict was handed down, that the trial, the sentence, and the subsequent release put an end to everything and put everything in its place. But in fact, such stories do not end so simply, because beyond the judicial decision, there remains something that cannot be restored: trust. Because for 22 days, people believed that they were facing a real tragedy. They were looking for it. They were worried. They followed the news. They hoped for a favorable outcome. And all this emotional involvement turned out to be based on a story that was not true. And it is cases like this that change perceptions, forcing people to doubt even when real victims appeared in front of them. To look for hidden motives, to not trust as before, and perhaps this is what makes such stories truly disturbing, because the consequences go far beyond one person and affect everyone who once believed. Because sometimes the most dangerous stories are not those that actually happen, but those that seem so plausible that it is impossible to not believe it.